Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, Dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, today we're just going to go through some dubious speculation for ETH, and in this video, what I'd like to do is talk about, is it still following the path from 2016 and or 2019? Has it deviated at all? And, what are some strategies to navigate something like this? The first thing I will say when we talk about anything besides Bitcoin is look to see what it's doing on its Bitcoin pair. Okay? And so for ETH, it makes sense to go view it on its Bitcoin pair. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, when ETH Bitcoin went below 0.04, I said that it's time to start to pivot the view, right? It's time to pivot the view. That doesn't mean that ETH Bitcoin can't go lower. It could, right? It's possible that it could. But one thing to think about here, and I've said this many times, right, is that in 2016 and in 2019, after ETH Bitcoin durably broke down, it bottomed within 8 to 9 weeks, okay? And if you look at this breakdown point right here in July, you can see that that recent low occurred about 8 weeks after ETH Bitcoin durably broke down. So because of that, right, it doesn't make sense in my mind to be as vocally bearish on ETH Bitcoin anymore. There are some conflicting views, for instance, one of which is if you were to overlay total assets, actually let's go over here and overlay total assets held by the Federal Reserve, you can see that last cycle that ETH Bitcoin bottomed out when the Fed pivoted from QT to QE, which they still haven't done yet, right? If you just take a line here and you go from when they pivoted from QT to QE, that's what marked the actual bottom for ETH Bitcoin, and they haven't done that yet, right? They haven't done that yet. But there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin bounces to the bull market support band and then comes back down and double bottoms like it did in 2019, and maybe the second low will correspond to a pivot from QT to QE. My point is that there's a lot of different conflicting views or conflicting indicators as to whether ETH Bitcoin has bottomed out yet or not. On one hand, you do have looser monetary policy in the sense that we just got a 50 basis point rate cut, and the market is still suggesting that there are more rate cuts to come. If you're to go look at CME Group and look at market expectations for rate cuts, the market right now is actually leaning towards another 50 basis point rate cut in November, and then in December another 25 basis point rate cut with a 28.8% chance that they go another 50 again. So because of that, we can't really say that looser monetary policy is a future thing when it's already happening, right? It's already happening. So because of that, it makes sense to at least flip to neutral, in my view, right? Kind of like 2019, where it made sense after that 2-month breakdown period to sort of flip to neutral on that view in preparation for it moving up the following year, right? In preparation for it moving up the following year. Now, what's interesting is in 2016, the low was in December for ETH Bitcoin. In 2019, the low was in September, but December was basically a double bottom or a slightly higher low. So what you could get is it could go a little bit lower now. Obviously, anything's possible, but at some point, you likely will get a bounce by ETH Bitcoin. And my guess is that on the first approach to the bull market support band, it will get rejected, just like on the first bounce, it got rejected in 2016 and 2019. But then it pulled back, consolidated, and then on the next attempt, it got through. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that plays out again here, where ETH Bitcoin, it finds a low, and again, the low could already be in. There, I would say some potential paths here could be something like this, where it bounces back up, back down, and then goes up, Another path could be where it goes just a bit lower, maybe to the 2016 high, at 0.036 and then bounces. But I gotta say, I mean, I feel like the window for something like that right now is going to close relatively soon, and then the window might open again in December, right? I mean, again, you can see in 2019 the window opened in December for ETH Bitcoin to put in a lower low, but it didn't. It ended up being a higher low, right? So I would say if it doesn't happen soon and ETH Bitcoin starts this rally back up to the bull market support band, right, then the next window might not occur until, the end of the year. It might be a few months before that happens again. But this is not why a lot of you guys are here, right? You don't really care about ETH Bitcoin, although I try to plead with you to care about it. And I've pleaded with people to how you preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio is by staying Bitcoin heavy during high interest rates in QT and only beginning to pivot after that, because most everything just bleeds against Bitcoin during that time period. But despite my best efforts, a lot of people don't care. So let's go talk about ETH-USD. So ETH-USD, one of the interesting things about it is that it actually still is following the blueprint from 2016 and arguably to some degree 2019. And I want to show what that is. And we actually talked about this a lot. But if you go through, right, if we go through the motions here of looking at what happened in 2016, what happened in 2019, there's this reality of, you have January. I don't know why I didn't do this before I started the video, but, if I have to do it, you have to watch me do it. You have all these months, right? And what's interesting is that in 2016, right, so let's go over here and say we have 2016, and then we also have 2024. What I find fascinating, and again, the market can deviate at any moment, and as I've said, with ETH Bitcoin below 0.04 already, it makes sense to hedge, absolutely, right? To me, it no longer makes sense to basically just be 100% Bitcoin, because if the market, first of all, if the market goes up, there's a chance that ETH could outperform Bitcoin in 2025, and also if the market goes down, it's not clear that ETH would necessarily get hit harder than Bitcoin at this point, right? It's not clear that's the case as much as it was clear previously, right? So, I think it does make sense to pivot that view. But if you look at 2016 and 2024, just go through this, right? You see 2016, January, February, and March were green. 2024, January, February, and March were green, right? So you basically have the first quarter of the year matches perfectly, right? The first quarter of the year matches perfectly. You have every single month as green, okay? Now it gets a little bit more nuanced because now the market calms down a little bit, right? April 2016 is red, and April 2024 is red. So then the uptrend, the powerful uptrend that began, in September, October of the prior year, right? This uptrend really began in October 2015. This one got going really in October 2023. The uptrend got called into question by April, right? By April. So in both 2016 and 2024, ETH was actually red in April. But then in May, it flipped back green. And I remember saying this back then, that a lot of times what happens, and you'll see this happen in many, many years. If you go back and look at a lot of the different years where Bitcoin and ETH go parabolic in like Q4 of the prior year into Q1, a lot of times what happens is in the last 2 weeks of April, Bitcoin goes down, and then everyone's like, oh, sell and man, go away. And what usually happens is that then in May, the markets bounce, and then you get a summer lull, right? So the markets bounce in May, and then they come down later on in the summer once it's more apparent that there actually will be a summer lull, right? So then in both cases, May was green, right? May was green. So then now you have everyone who basically YOLO'd into the top, probably got scared in April and sold late April because of sell and man, go away, and then the market ripped them a new one, right? It went right back up. They then YOLO back in. They're like, I shouldn't have sold for the sell and man, go away. And then the summer lull sets in where June, July, and August are red, right? Every single one, right? June, July, and August are red. Basically, the entire summer ends up being red, even though there were a lot of people that would have been convinced of that in late April, they probably stopped believing it because of the May rally. Again, we talked a lot about this back then. I know a lot of people might not remember it because it wasn't necessarily what people wanted to hear back then, but that's what happened, right? Where you basically got a 3 months in a row that ended up being red. And then I said, and I put out this video last month. I was like, well, look, guys, if the fractal follow, right? I mean, it's not even a fractal, right? I mean, it's just a pattern, right? If the pattern follows, which again, it might not, if the pattern follows though, you get a green September, right? Because in September of 2016, ETH was green. And if you remember, there's 2 prior years where ETH Bitcoin broke down. 2 prior years, right? 2016 and 2019. In both of those years, ETH was green. 2016 was green. 2019 was green, right? And a lot of times, ETH is not green in September, right? It was in 2023, but so was Bitcoin. It was only barely green. It was green like a 1.5%. But if you look at 2022, ETH was red. If you look at 2021, September, ETH was red. If I don't know, September of 2020, ETH was red, right? September of 2019, ETH was green. September of 2018, ETH was red. September of 2017, ETH was red, right? So really, 2 of the years, right? And then September of 2016, September 2015, ETH was red. So there's only been 3 years where ETH has been green in September. 4. 2016, 2019, and 2023. I'm saying 4 because I'm assuming, unless something catastrophic happens over the weekend or Monday, I'm assuming ETH will be green in September. Okay, so then you're back to green, right? You're back to a green month. And that doesn't mean that the rally's over, right? It could continue, actually. It's possible, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can see that this pattern has followed so far. Now, again, it doesn't mean the final phase will follow. And I want to be clear about that, right? As much as this is, as much fun as we have here with dubious speculation and trying to predict what's going to happen. And, one day you feel like you're a genius and then the next day the market's saying, no, you're not. I can't tell you how many times people went from thinking like, oh, he knows exactly where ETH Bitcoin is going over the last 3 years. And then every single time it rallied on up, everyone comes out to dunk, right? Everyone. And then it just ended up being a lower high. Okay. It's a brutal market, right? It's a tough process to watch play out, but it has played out. And so the question is will the final part of the 2016 pattern play out? And unfortunately, again, this is one of those things where you hope for the best, plan for the worst. So it's absolutely fine to be hedged, right? Again, ETH Bitcoin is probably either bottomed or within striking distance of a bottom, right? I would say if 0.038 fails to hold, then maybe 0.036, and then absolute worst case, I would say 0.03. But I don't really think ETH Bitcoin is going to go to 0.03. I would say it's the worst case scenario, but it's not even my base case, right? It's not even my base case. I would say it's more likely that the 0.036 to 0.038 area holds than ETH having to go all the way down to 0.03. But we will see, right? We will see if that actually plays out. So then what happened in 2016, right? In Q4? It ended up being just 3 reds in a row, right? So you had 3 reds in a row, June, July, August, and then you had 3 reds in a row, October, November, December. So what's interesting is that this is how 2016 played out. And I remember I've talked about this so much. I remember how brutal it was, right? We talked about this so many times and how by the end of it, everyone was so demoralized, right? Now, let's ignore the wick in June. Let's just ignore it. Okay, let's just say we only care about, weekly closes or we're just going to ignore that wick. How long did it take for ETH to take out the prior high durably, right? Durably, not just a wick. March set the high. June, it wicked higher, but it mostly just stayed below it. It was a full year, A full year, right? March of 2017. So this was March of 2024. What if ETH takes this out, but not until March of 2025, which is exactly when Bitcoin dominance normally goes down, right? In the post-halving year. So you have to wonder, right? I mean, is there a case to be made that that's what's going to happen? That, that it takes another few months? And listen, guys, I don't want to be the bad guy. I mean, I can go find all the bull cases. And by the way, one of the things to remember, if you're looking at this and saying, well, where does that put Bitcoin? In 2016, Bitcoin actually went up while ETH was going down. Surprisingly, right? Bitcoin was going up, ETH was going down. So there does exist a scenario where that happens, but I think Ethereum is a lot more highly correlated to Bitcoin these days. So I would assume that if Bitcoin's going up, ETH was going up, and if Bitcoin's going down, ETH is going down, right? I wouldn't assume that it would follow, like this pattern where Bitcoin goes up in Q4, but ETH goes down. Although there is a case that that could happen. It's just not what I would consider to be the most likely scenario. So what happens, right? What happens in Q4? And if it is red, if Q4 is red, where does it actually put ETH? You can see that in 2016, when ETH went back down, it swept the low from April, right? It swept the April low. It also swept the August low. It went below the August low. There was also a really bad wick here in August 2016 as well, just like there was in August 2024. See that? But one of the key differences, one of the differences here between 2016 and 2024 is that in 2016, in September, like ETH quickly recovered from this wick in August, and the September rally basically took it back up to the March high. So today that would correspond to 4K. But it hasn't been as strong, right? Like you can see it actually hasn't been as strong here in 2024. It's been a little bit weaker, right? So instead of going all the way back up, it's still kind of stuck down here. And if you look a little closer, right? If we go look, let's go look at the weekly time frame, right? If you look a little closer, what you'll see is that, so I just delete everything. Hold on a second. I don't want to delete all that. So let me just go to ETH-USD, but I'm going to go over to a different chart, right? So we're going to go look at it over here. So now you have to say, all right, well, why is it weaker, right? Why is it weaker than 2016? Because in 2016, again, you can see that ETH, I mean, the March low in 2016, ETH stayed above that more or less until it wicked below it at the end of the year. But this time, the March low has been easily taken out, right? It's been a lot weaker in 2024 than in 2016. Now, it sort of makes sense. I mean, it's Ethereum's got a much larger market cap today, than it did back then. And so it would, it would make sense that it would be harder to keep it, as elevated. It makes sense that it wouldn't go up or hold it just as much. But I wonder if part of the issue right now for ETH is that it's still below its bull market support band, right? So in 2016, when ETH rallied in September, right? Remember, ETH was green in September. When it rallied in September, it was above the bull market support band, right? It really never got any weekly closes below it. Whereas this time it has. You see the difference between 2016 and then 2024? Here, no weekly closes below the bull market support band, but in 2024, there have been. Okay? And interestingly, there's a lot of other similarities, right? After the March top, ETH went down to the bull market support band and then bounced into June. Same thing right here, right? It went into the bull market support band and then bounced into June. The main difference is that in 2016, ETH-USD held support at the bull market support band, but in 2024, it did not, right? It did not. And so, fortunately for us, there's another comparison that we can make, right? And we can say, well, 2016 is not the only year where ETH Bitcoin broke down, right? It's not. It also broke down in 2019. And in 2019, you can see that ETH was also green in September, right? It was also green in September. You see that? And the 2 months before it were red, right? July and August were red. September ended up being green. October was also green by about 0.5%. And then ETH went a little bit lower in November and December. But in this case, right, when you look at 2019, what you'll notice is that ETH also got pinned beneath the bull market support band. And what's interesting is if you zoom into 2019, there was a drop, a rally, another drop, and then 3 green candles that took ETH back up to the bull market support band. And then it got rejected, right? But guess where it topped, right? Guess where it topped? It topped in September of 2019. And then, the following week, it got a pretty big rejection off of the bull market support band. So the main difference between 2016 and 2019 is that in 2016, ETH was going above the 20-week estimate, and then it fell below it. This time in 2019, it really never got above it until, the beginning of the following year. And then this time in 2024, it still is below it. But interestingly, just like over here, ETH had 3 green candles in a row to get it back up to the bull market support band. And here we are in our 3rd green candle, right? 1, 2, and 3. Now it hasn't gotten up there yet. And there's no guarantee that it will. But I would say, considering that Bitcoin is above the bull market support band, right? Considering that Bitcoin is above it, and considering that the altcoin market, right, total 3 is above it, it stands to reason to think that, hey, there's a good chance that ETH will rally back up to it as well. Now, I want to take this moment to say there's a lot of people out there that, they're knee deep in altcoins, they're dunking on ETH, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've seen this type of stuff before. Normally, ETH is sort of the harbinger for the altcoin market. So, a lot of times ETH can be the last thing to really move before a trend changes. Just like at the end of a bull market, you get the ETH tsunami, right? Where ETH goes up approximately 2x in about 2 weeks. We saw that at the end of 2017 or early 2018. We saw it in 2021, right? We've seen that a lot before. So because the altcoin market is above it, because Bitcoin is above it, to me, it would stand a reason that ETH could at least rally up to it, right? I'm not even saying it has to get above it, although it could. I'm just saying, if it follows 2019, it would rally back up to the 20-week SMA or the 21-week EMA, right? And it would do so relatively soon. And then the question, right? The question is then going to be, what happens in Q4, right? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, debating in my mind. And look, guys, you could make a case either way. Honestly, easily make a case either way. For instance, if you go look at the website really quick, one of the things you'll notice for the ROI after the low for Bitcoin, it's right where it always is at this time. So why can't it go up in Q4, right? This is where Bitcoin always is at this point in the cycle. Like, zoom in. It's literally right where the last 2 cycles were, right in between them at this point in the cycle, right? So you can't look at that and come to, you can't look at this by itself and come to a bearish conclusion. You could look at the ROI after the cycle peak, right? And say, well, there still is a chance here that, that Bitcoin gets more in line with the last 2 cycles as measured from the peak. That's always a chance that it could play out like that. The other thing is that, I think we should get a lot of clarity here in the next couple of weeks because, with Bitcoin, and I've said this many, many times, right? The 2019 fractal ended when the August low occurred, right? Because in 2019, you essentially had that extra low, right? That extra low that occurred after everyone thought the downtrend was over. And you got a double bottom, right? You got a double bottom. Bitcoin rallied back up to the bull market support band. and then took out the lower high structure. Now, we did get a hard landing, but I'm not asking you to focus on that right now. Like, I'm just like, to me, it doesn't make sense to focus on that until after Bitcoin has even broken through the lower high structure, right? If Bitcoin breaks through the lower high structure, then that can be something we talk about. But at this point, it hasn't done that. And there are some, like, again, and I'm only pointing it out because I don't really feel like it's being covered anywhere else. And I like to look at what is the risk, right? Is there a risk associated with the market right now, or is it just up only in Q4? There's always a chance it's just up only in Q4. But is there a risk? Like, has this stuff happened before? And you could make the case, right? I mean, you could make the case that, when Bitcoin topped out here in June of 2019, it dropped about 35%. And then this is right when the first rate cut occurred, right? And when Bitcoin got that first rate cut, it rallied about as much as it had dropped in terms of percent, right? It dropped 35% and then it rallied 35%. Now, because its percentage doesn't get it back up to the high, right? But it dropped 35%, rallied 35% right after the first rate cut, right? And then you go look at it over here and you take it from the top and you're like, all right, well, how far did it drop? Oh, about 34%. And how far has Bitcoin rallied? About 34%, right? And so, the counterpoint is, well, yeah, but Ben, when it rallied over here and broke the lower high structure, this was after a double bottom, right? There was a double bottom, and we just had a double bottom. So you could easily make the case that it looks like 2019, right? That it, basically that Bitcoin just got this double bottom right there, just like it's gotten this double bottom right here, right? Where you have a sort of a wick below it, but, you have a low in July and then a low in September. Is it not the same? Could be, absolutely. But, just to make sure we check all our bases off, there was also a double bottom before the first rate cut in 2019, right? Because the Fed cut literally right here. That was when the Fed cut rates. And then right when they cut, Bitcoin rallied for 2 weeks. So it's hard to know, right? I mean, are we here? Or are we here? So when you think about, what does Bitcoin do in Q4? There does exist a scenario where ETH and Bitcoin diverge in Q4. But I just wanted to get this on your radar, right? There's two different views. And, I've gone through this process all year where there's one group of people and all they do, right? All they do is tell you all the meme coins are going to the moon. And then when they drop 50%, they just quietly disappear. And then they come back when the market goes up again. But you have to be careful, right? I mean, there's always a downside risk. That doesn't mean not to have exposure. I mean, the alternative is you just sit in nothing for years and years and years, and you have no exposure. So for me, what I've done for the last few years, as I've mentioned many, many times, is I just kept my exposure limited to Bitcoin, because my expectation was that Bitcoin would outperform most everything else. With ETH Bitcoin going below 0.04, I think it makes sense to start to hedge those views, right? I do. There's a chance, right? There is a chance that ETH Bitcoin has bottomed, but ETH-USD could still go lower. And that's one of those things where, like, I think a lot of people have trouble wrapping their head around. They're like, what do you mean? Like, how can ETH go lower if it's bottomed against Bitcoin? That's just what happened, right? That's what happened in 2019. That's the only reason I mention it, right? If it didn't happen in 2019, I probably wouldn't mention it, because, you would then just look at 2016, where ETH Bitcoin and ETH-USD bottomed at the same time, right? Like, if you go look at 2016, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in December, the same time when ETH-USD bottomed, right? But in 2019, if you overlay ETH Bitcoin onto the chart, ETH Bitcoin bottomed here the first week of September. Right after it bottomed, ETH rallied to the bull market support band over the next 3 weeks. You see that? After it bottomed, ETH rallied to the bull market support band over the next 3 weeks. And then if you fast forward to this cycle, you could argue, if this is the low, right? If this is the low, right? Which I don't know if it is, but if it is, let's just, for this purpose, let's say it is. if it is, you can see that, look, just like 2019, it's rallying to the bull market support band over the next 3 weeks, right? I mean, it's not there yet, and it might not get there, but it's not even that far, guys. I mean, another $100, and it's basically there. If it gets to, yeah, like just over 28.42. 28.42 is the 21-week EMA. But do you see how similar that is, right? So ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September of 2019, and then it rallied to the bull market support band after ETH Bitcoin bottomed, right? ETH-USD rallied to the bull market support band after ETH Bitcoin bottomed. But then ETH got rejected by the bull market support band. Okay? And then basically it went sideways until November, and then it fell again, and then it fell again in December. And then that was that, right? That was it. And then the market started to go back up. And then, of course, we had the hard landing. Okay. So when I look at this, right, I'm like, all right, well, I mean, it stands to reason that ETH could rally up to the bull market support band. And then the question is, does it march on through or does it get rejected, right? I mean, Bitcoin's marching on through, right? The question, though, for Bitcoin is it another lower high like 2019, right? Are we here where it breaks out, or are we here after the first rate cut? You see the difference, right? You see the difference? So it really depends, right? I mean, if Bitcoin just keeps going up, there's a good chance ETH is going to follow it. If Bitcoin gets rejected, then obviously that would not be great for ETH, more than likely. Although it still could be that ETH Bitcoin has already bottomed. So going back to ETH, if you look at 2016, ETH was red October, November, December. If you look at 2019, ETH was red November and December, but it was green in October. Okay, so I'm just saying, guys, keep an open mind. Hope for the best, right? Hope for the best. Plan for the worst. There does exist a scenario where ETH does go down in Q4, and then everyone gives up on it, and then it goes up next year and takes out the March high just like it did, 1 year later, right? It just took a full year. When ETH did this in 2019, it put in a top in June, and then it durably took that out about 1 year later, right? In July of the following year. But March of 2025 is still half a year away, right? So if it takes another 6 months for ETH to durably go above where it was in March of 2024, yeah, there's plenty of time for ETH to still show some weakness before that occurs. And if it does, it might be similar to what happened in 2019, right? Or 2016, where it shows weakness in Q4 and then bounces early 2025, right? And then goes up. So I just wanted to put that out there. You have to understand, I can't know what's going to happen. Just because my views have been right so far this year on ETH, Bitcoin, it doesn't mean they're going to continue to be right. And so the way that you navigate that, right, is you hedge, right? At least not financial advice, it's just the way I navigate it, is you hedge against that view. Because, whether ETH goes up now or whether it goes up later, probably most of the people watching the video would assume that in a few years, whatever happens next year, a few years now from down the road, ETH will probably be higher, right? Even if there is a recession, right? Even if there is a recession, ETH will probably be higher a few years down the road. So hedging can often make sense, right? And again, the reason it makes sense now more so to me than it ever did before was because there now exists a scenario where if Bitcoin drops, it doesn't mean that ETH is going to underperform it, right? It's not as obvious like it had been for the last 3 years, at least obvious to me. Now it's not as clear that ETH has to underperform it. It's possible that ETH does, but I don't think it's going to underperform it for too much longer. I think the gears are going to slowly turn and go the other way in 2025. So, that is, I just wanted to sort of check up on this view because I remember we put out a video, we put out several videos on Ethereum a few weeks ago, and I was like, guys, these are my views for the end of the year, but it first involves ETH going up in September, just like it did in 2016 and just like it did in 2019. And then we figure out what happens in Q4. What's interesting is we will get labor market data next week. So that might help set the tone for the rest of the year. For instance, if the unemployment rate keeps going up, then that could be reason enough to reject ETH off the bull market support band. If it goes back down or you get something different, then that might be the reason why I could be wrong and it doesn't go down in Q4, right? So the point is like, you want to recognize that there are certain times where it makes more sense to hedge than other times, right? And for the last 3 years, it made very little sense in my mind to hold ETH. Because ETH Bitcoin, as far as I was concerned, was just in a macro downtrend, right? Just in a macro downtrend. And I find myself today, the same people that spent so much of their energy debating my views on ETH Bitcoin for the last 3 years, now they're bearish on it, right? Now they got their piles of altcoins and they're dunking on ETH Bitcoin. And I'm like, wait a second. They were the ones that told me I was wrong up here at 0.08. And now they're dunking on ETH Bitcoin at 0.04. When all the gurus are dunking on it, it's probably in a bottoming process, right? It doesn't mean it can't go a little bit lower, but you have to think back. Everyone, it seems like, is getting very bearish on ETH Bitcoin, and they're saying it's dying, and that their altcoin's going to take it over, and etc. Right? But you have to wonder, right? I mean, why are they saying that now? Why didn't they say it over here at 0.08? They're only saying it now because now that's what the cool thing to do is, right? It's now cool to be bearish on ETH Bitcoin because it's been going down for 3 years. And if you take the opposing view, you get laughed at, just like you got laughed at if you took the bearish view up here, right? It wasn't cool to be bearish on ETH Bitcoin at 0.08 when half the Cryptoverse was talking about the flipping, right? It wasn't cool to be bearish on it back then. Now it's cool to be bearish on it because everyone is. But if everyone is turning bearish on it and they're dunking on it, it probably means that it's probably going to bottom out between now and the end of the year, and there's a good chance the bottom's in or very close to being in. I don't know how much lower it's going to go. What I said before is 0.038 seems close enough to me, right? Because my target was 0.03 to 0.04. If 0.038 does not hold, then I would argue 0.036. What's interesting is if you look at, the pattern from 2019, it's basically just adding 0.02 to it, right? I mean, if you look at a price label, the low here before the rally was 0.024, and then here it was 0.044, 0.045, whatever, 0.045, whatever. And then here it was 0.016. So far it's gone to 0.038. So, it's always possible that it goes a little bit lower. But I think the point is that, when no one thought it was possible that ETH Bitcoin could go down, they were bull posting on it. Now, those same people have abandoned the ETH Bitcoin valuation in favor of their altcoins, right? But it seems to me that there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin turns around just as everyone finally believes that ETH Bitcoin was bearish, right? Now that everyone believes it, it can't be true for that much longer. At least that's how I would think about it. So yeah, that's where I stand. And I will talk more about ETH-USD. I think one of the things that can get people in trouble is they look at this analysis and are like, all right, well, they'll just sit on their hands in case, in hopes that it drops in Q4. And I'd still contend there's a good chance that it does. If it falls 2016 and 2019, it would. But there's also a chance that it doesn't. And so that's why hedging makes sense. I mean, it helps you sleep at night at the very least. And also it just to say, look, there's no guarantee that, what anyone says on Twitter is no guarantee what they say is true. right? Um, and it does make sense to be, to sort of be planned for other outcomes. And one of the things that I think that Bitcoin needs to get through in the short term is like if you look at I'm not a huge fan of RSI, because I used to be a little bit more of a fan of it, and then I stopped becoming a fan of it because so many people told me why Bitcoin dominance had topped out in for the last 3 years because of the RSI, right? Like if you go look at like the RSI for Bitcoin dominance, like there's been so many people that are like, oh, it's topped because of it's bearish divergence, right? Like it put in a top here in October, and then it was just going down. The RSI was going down while the RSI, or while the valuation was going up, and therefore people are like, oh, it's bearish divergence. It means that Bitcoin dominance is topped out, and then Bitcoin dominance only just kept going higher, right? And if you look at the monthly RSI for Bitcoin dominance, which might be a little bit more helpful, it's only ever been bullish, right? It's only ever been bullish. But if you go look at sort of like the daily RSI for Bitcoin, the one thing that I think Bitcoin needs to get through to really this is the battle it's going to face, I think, before it can break through the actual lower high structure, right? So you see this lower high structure that Bitcoin's been in? This is the battle it's going to have to get through. And I'm not saying it can't, it could, but I think this is what the experts might call like hidden divergence, where you basically have higher highs on the RSI, so still potential room for it to go higher, but you have lower highs on the price, right? So you have lower price, but higher highs on the RSI. So Bitcoin needs to break through that, right? That's going to be the key test, and you can see how it could easily line up, right? I mean, you can see this is sort of that window right there. That would be the window right there. That's going to be the big test for Bitcoin, is can it break through? If it can break through and that corresponds to basically being an RSI, daily RSI of 70, which is, above it, the experts would call it overbought. But that's what I would watch. If Bitcoin can get through that, then there's a decent chance they could lift ETH up with it. If Bitcoin gets rejected from that, like it got rejected in July and in May, then, that's reason enough that ETH-USD could go down in Q4, even if ETH Bitcoin goes up. So those are, it's my general view on ETH and ETH Bitcoin. And, it's interesting because it's a long process. I remember looking at this pattern back in March, showing you guys, being like, man, if it plays out like 2016 or like 2019, this is going to be one hell of a year, right? With a lot of swings in both directions. And sure enough, the emotions are flying just like they did in 2016 and 2019. But again, we'll see. We'll see how it plays out in Q4, and I'll be here. I'll come on, guys. If Bitcoin, if ETH gets above its bull market support band and can hold it as support, then it would make sense to ignore the Q4 move in 2016 and 2019, right? There's nothing wrong with pivoting a view. My point is that this is what happened in 2016. This is what happened in 2019. I'm going to hedge because ETH Bitcoin is below 0.04, which is the target range that I've given for 3 years. But it doesn't mean that the final piece of the puzzle won't play out, right? The final piece of the puzzle could play out. And if it does, it will be just like it was during the last 2 cycles, right? Just like it was. But again, I just wanted to leave that with you guys. I know there's been a lot of discussion as to what's going on with ETH, and not even from a bullish perspective. I've seen a lot of people just sort of dunking on it because Bitcoin and altcoins are above their bull market support bands. Like Bitcoin and the altcoin market are above those levels, right? Look at alts. Had a pretty nice rally so far. And if you go look at it on the daily, this is breaking the lower high structure. You can see it's breaking it. So I think that's why I think some people are looking at ETH and they're getting a little concerned. Like, well, alts are breaking through. Bitcoin, and by the way, I mean, alts also broke through in 2019 and they still ended up having some weakness after that. I mean, like if you look at 2019 and you look at sort of some lower highs, there are definitely times where alts broke through and then they fell back down to the trend line, which could easily happen. I mean, that could happen as well, where like alts are breaking through and then maybe they fall back down to the trend line and then go up in 2025. That's always a possibility too. But we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. I've rambled long enough. I think you guys understand my views. And again, it's just dubious speculation. I have no idea what is going to happen in the markets. Just because I'm right about ETH Bitcoin so far does not mean I will be right. Just because the views on ETH-USD have panned out so far this year does not mean they will continue to. And anyone who's been here long enough will tell you that I certainly do get things wrong. So please do remember that. Hedge accordingly. I'm hedging accordingly because ETH Bitcoin has gone below 0.04. But if it plays out like the last two cycles, then you could see, one last sort of move down in Q4, which could be the end of it before it finally moves up and potentially goes to new all-time highs. We'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.